42 years ago, she checked into a motel under a false name and disappeared. No ID, no witnesses, only a strange folded paper, a string of symbols no one could read. Decades passed. The case grew cold. Then new DNA science and a dogged team unlocked a family map, and an ordinary man with quiet hands was charged. But the true shock, the symbols, the origin code keys wound through a life none of us knew. Stay till the end to uncover how one paper changed everything. The summer of 1983 in a quiet Oregon town smelled of hot asphalt and patchwork roses. People left their windows open, trusting the dark. For most, the night slid into the next day with nothing remarkable to show for it. But for a handful of people, a motel desk clerk named Evelyn, a man with a 3-day beard and a tie he'd never worn to a job he no longer had, and a young woman who handled her grief like a private currency, the night became a line in a ledger of loss. She arrived late, the sort of late that slurs days together. The registration book would later show the false name, Marta Klein. She carried nothing except a small, scuffed purse and a battered paperback. She paid cash. The clerk remembered the way she tapped the paper on the counter, a little nervous, like someone testing the world to see how it felt when you touched it. The room was ordinary by every measure. Linoleum floor, a lamp with a fringe, the cheap floral pattern that made everything look older. The woman slept like the tired dew. In the morning, she left a note folded into the toe of a shoe. Not a plea, not directions, just 6 characters written in shaky ink. OX 7K Delta 3. When her body was found 2 days later, the town pressed its palm to its chest and tried to wake up. There was no ID, no purse, no phone, only the folded paper. No CCTV then, no cell phones, few fingerprints on record. It was the kind of hole that swallowed reputations and left the town arguing over what the hole meant. Detective Mark Weller was the first to walk the linoleum, the first to bend down over that folded piece of paper and feel. Not for the meaning of the marks, but for the absence of meaning. He took the note to the coroner, to the local schoolteacher who dabbled in code puzzles, to anyone who might make sense of a child's scrawl. Everyone shrugged. The note would go into an evidence locker with the other things unsolved cases collect. Cigarette butts, hair, a single earring whose mate remained mystically absent. When the town buried her, they named her Jane Doe number 83. They erected a small marker, and strangers left flowers and apologies. The story cooled like pie left out overnight. It became the kind of rumor that lived in houses with curtains drawn, whispered at kitchen tables, heightening the town's sense of smallness. People sleepwalked past the motel, averting their eyes. The case drifted into the background of their lives the way a scar discolors skin. You see it, but it no longer stings. Years rearranged themselves around unsolved mysteries. The evidence locker in the county police basement is a museum of unfinished questions. Boxes labeled with dates, pens, and hope. The townspeople moved on. Kids grew up in houses that still had that town's wallpaper. New businesses opened and closed. The motel changed its manager twice and replaced the lamp in the room with a newer, less sentimental model. But in the climate-controlled dark, Jane Doe's box waited. Inside was other stuff that refused to belong to a story. A small bra with a missing clasp, a shoe with yellowing elastic, fibers clinging like barnacles, and the folded paper that would be known to a generation of detectives as the key. The coroner preserved tissue, a hair sample, a few outdated smears. In a different era, this would have been routine. In 1983, DNA was a theory in a Wiltshire lab. Genetic markers told no tales people trusted. Detective Weller filed a report that read like many. Suspicious circumstances, no witnesses, no definite cause of identification. He retired with a hip like an old hinge and a conscience that clicked sometimes in the night, waking him with the smell of motel coffee. He couldn't shake the symbols. The teacher's amateur code, a substitution cipher based on an alphabet from a children's book, yielded nothing but matched letters that formed no sentence. The town forgot in the way of towns, with a gentle, collective shrug. Occasionally journalists would turn up for an anniversary, 10 years, 20, and ask for comments that felt like polishing old wounds. The coroner's office moved to a new facility. The locker moved with it. For 20 years, the box was labeled, handled, and shelved. Officers rotated through, each glance as uninterested as the last. You could measure time by the dust. But evidence does something quietly miraculous. It does not decay into fiction easily. It waits. And when the world's tools change, evidence wakes like an animal at a long overdue feeding. The early 2000s were a turning point for cold cases. Genealogical databases and refined DNA techniques became the new archaeology. Labs that had once extracted tiny, indecipherable fragments of life were suddenly reading entire ancestral maps. Like turning up a brittle manuscript and finding out it contained the names of people in your family tree. The county's cold case unit got a grant. They dusted off cold boxes and invoices and a half-forgotten whiteboard marked with names and nothing more. A determined forensic analyst named Lena Ortiz loved puzzles. She had a way of seeing potential in things others had shelved as hopeless. When the lab pulled the Jane Doe tissue, a single, degraded sample, she saw not ruin but a thick instruction manual of human code. Took months. Samples that had once yielded nothing now returned partial profiles. The technology stitched together broken strands of autosomal DNA, mitochondrial breadcrumbs, and the occasional microsatellite. Lena uploaded what she could into public genealogy databases where willing participants had already done a kind of rough genealogy for the internet age. The matches were faint but real. Second cousins, once removed, a handful of relatives who had never suspected their branches could whisper back to them. Using patient, legal genealogical work, triangulation, family tree building, the tedious email script that began, "Hello, you may not know me, but I'm helping a cold case." The investigators mapped a family network spanning states and choices nobody expected. The map pointed to a cluster of surnames concentrated around the northern part of the state and, interestingly, to a man who had lived briefly near the motel in 1983. The man's name on paper matched no one. On the street, however, people called him Ben Hardy, a handyman, known for quiet work and private mornings. He had a past like sediment, thin layers of marriages, moves, and small offenses. The genealogical map put him in the right place and time with an ancestor link strong enough to warrant a conversation. But proof on paper is a thin thing next to justice. The cold case team moved carefully. They were aware of what genealogical sleuthing had done for other cases, reunions, arrests, pain reopened. They wanted not vindication for themselves, but certainty for a family who might not yet know they had a name to grieve. Ben Hardy was a name people used in casual sentences. Ben fixed my porch rail. He had the kind of face towns forget between coffee and lunch. Unremarkable, patient, good at small talk. He lived alone in a small house with an overgrown yard and memories that hid in the walls. He'd aged into a quietness that some mistook for wisdom. Others who'd known him briefly recalled a temper kept polite in company, and a habit of leaving the town in the summers for jobs that took him into neighboring counties. When a team of officers arrived at his door in the cool of a gray morning, people watched from behind curtains and thought of other things. Groceries, their own memories of simple kindnesses, the stories that break a neighborhood down the way as storm strips leaves. Ben answered the door with the flatness of someone used to hearing his name in neutral tones. He did not run. He did not hiss denial. They explained the reason for their visit. He invited them in, as if hospitality could smooth the hardness of the conversation. When officers asked about the motel, about movement in 1983, Ben's answers were calibrated low. "I was around. I fixed things." He agreed to provide a DNA sample and to let them look through old work logs, truck receipts, any evidence that would pin him to the motel that summer. For a while, the story was a slow-moving machine. Samples, warrants, polite legal letters. The town held its breath and kept chopping vegetables. In the station, detectives spun the wheel of the case file and tried to reconcile the neat man who fixed porches with a forensic map that seemed to put him at the center of a tragedy. Was this the cruelty of coincidence or the anatomy of guilt? The turning point came when Lena's lab compared the DNA from the hospital tissue and a partial profile that matched to Ben with a probability that made probability itself look thin. The microsatellite markers, the rare genetic wobble, the pattern in a locus that is statistically unusual, these were the sorts of details that make cold cases become headlines. The county district attorney petitioned the court. A warrant was issued. The motel room that had been dusted for decades exhaled its secrets one last time. In an evidence bag they found fibers, old, now brittle, that matched Ben's work jacket, intact enough for the lab to tie to a specific brand he owned. Nothing in isolation proved a crime, but woven together, the genealogical map, Ben's presence in town, a partial DNA match, the fibers, the motif on a receipt that placed his truck near the motel. A story began to congeal. A story strong enough to charge a man. Courtrooms are theaters of memory. They are where memories are folded into questions, and facts are scrubbed clean until they glint. The prosecution presented the science like maps. The DNA lines, the genealogical dots, the fibers and receipts that sketched a path toward the motel the week the woman died. They told the court that Jane Doe was not just an unsolved case. She was a person entitled to a name and a story. The defense argued noise. They argued reasonable doubt. They showed Ben as a man who worked with materials that lots of people owned. They argued that proximity did not equal culpability. They insisted that partial DNA matches were only pieces of a puzzle without context. But the public, hooked the way audiences are to any slow-burn drama, watched the slow reveal. Witnesses who had been teenagers in 1983 testified about a man they had seen fix a faucet at the motel and then leave abruptly that week. Neighbors described the suddenness of his summer departures and the way he sometimes carried a heavy toolbox. Lena took the stand and explained genealogy to a jury as if she were teaching the alphabet. Patient, steady, reducing the complex to the comprehensible. At one point, the judge allowed evidence about the folded note as possible motive proof. The unusual symbols, Lena suggested on cross, might indicate a personal cipher between two people who shared a past or a secret. The jury heard the story of the note, of the woman who checked in under a false name, of the man who had been in the area fixing things. The prosecution did not need to invent a story to make this narrative compelling. The fragments were enough to outline a tragedy. The verdict was a slow drumbeat. In the gallery, family members of missing persons sat, some with hope, some with a cautious relief they had not anticipated. When the jury returned with a verdict that named a man responsible for the death of Jane Doe number 83, the room inhaled like a town taking its first true breath in decades. For some it was justice. For others it was an uneasy resolution that always felt like it should have been faster. After the verdict, attention turned to the woman. The forensics office, the detective, Lena, and a team of volunteers began a second kind of work, to give Jane Doe the name she deserved. They fed dental records, family trees, and a mosaic of tiny DNA clues into every tool at their disposal. Piece by piece, a life reassembled. Her real name, Teresa Peroni, emerged from letters, old files, and forgotten medical charts. She had once been a promising nursing student in a neighboring city, the kind of bright, practical young woman who kept a stash of paperback novels on her bedside table. She had moved between jobs and towns, writing letters to friends with the kind of honesty that read honest even in the margins. She had loved music that swelled and quieted with grief. She had disappeared at a time when her life's balance was off, when small decisions rippled into absence. When the name became known, family members came forward. A cousin remembered a girl with a laugh like a short burst of wind. She had left for reasons small and heartbreaking. A bad breakup, money gone missing, a sense that she needed to disappear for a while to survive. They had searched at the time, how could they not? But leads in the early 1980s were meager. The police had done what they could. The family had grown older. They had the sterile comfort of not knowing and the harder grief of learning after so many years. The folded paper remained a stubborn relic. The prosecution had posited it as a cipher between two people, maybe a code the woman and someone else used to leave messages that only the two could read. The defense insisted it was random. After the trial, a linguist volunteer tried again. She compared the symbols to regional dialect slang, camp notebooks, and maritime shorthand. The most compelling theory turned to be not espionage nor high melodrama, but something quieter. A personal shorthand, a list of times and initials, a recipe for escape, perhaps, that only Teresa and someone who'd known her very intimately would have recognized. That interpretation fit. But even with a name and a conviction, life did not snap back neatly into place. The town had changed. The motel was boarded for a while and then reopened under new management. Ben's neighbors argued about what justice really meant when it arrived decades late. The family of Teresa lived with the tension of knowing that a name could both comfort and reopen a wound. For Detective Weller, Lena, and others, there were late nights of paperwork and small private victories. For the town, there was a new story to tell visitors, not of fear, but of a community that saw one of their missing return to the ledger of names. For those who had been young when the crime occurred, the verdict was a punctuation mark that let them close a chapter or rewrite it, depending on how the sentence landed in their chest. In the end, the note, the origin code keys, as some reporters began to call it, remained a private thing between the dead and the living. It had catalyzed a chain of science and persistence that gave voice to a woman who had been silenced. It had also provoked questions about the ethics of genealogical sleuthing, the slow pace of small-town justice, and what it means to find closure when you have waited generations for an answer. Cold cases are not neat packages you can place on a shelf without thinking of the hands that wrapped them. They are stories of small choices, an argument, a decision to walk a different street, a missed appointment, and of the stubborn work that brings those small choices into a light so everyone can see them. The origin code keys became more than a list of symbols. It became a reminder of what modern science can do when paired with the refusal to let memory calcify into neglect. Detectives, lab techs, volunteers, and grieving relatives showed up every day in different ways to insist that a life matters. They reminded the town, and your viewers, that names matter, that even when the world has moved on, truth waits patiently in evidence boxes and in the minds of those who never stopped asking. Like and subscribe.